right, I guess it's about that time. So, hello, I'm Emily. I'm a postdoc in Andrew's auditory lab. I also am doing a split postdoc in a computational visual neuroscience lab too, so I'm doing both auditory and vision at the same time. But I got my PhD in Andrew's lab, and I took this class as an undergrad, so I've seen it from all vantage points. I've TA'd it, I've instructed it. This will be my first time giving this lecture, so fingers crossed that it goes somewhat smoothly. Yeah, this was my favorite class as an undergrad. Hopefully you guys also enjoy it. So today we'll be talking about music expertise and generalization. And so this is kind of a popular topic in the media. Many people are kind of curious about whether musical training helps with things other than becoming a better musician. Can it make you smarter? Can it improve your math skills? Can it improve your vocabulary? And certainly the idea is appealing, and it's nice if, spending all these hours practicing a musical instrument and the money that you spend on music lessons can actually generalize to other benefits. It's like if you take a class and it counts for multiple credits, that's always a nice bonus. So we're going to kind of look at some of the studies that delve into this topic. So we know that music is quite universal. We find it in cultures around the world, and I'm sure Andrew has mentioned that. And it's often integral with other activities, often social activities. And in some cases, music has a participatory role where everyone's involved in the singing and everyone's involved in the playing of instruments. But of course, it can also be more passive. So if we go to the orchestra, if we go to a concert, we aren't necessarily hopping up on stage, grabbing a cello and, playing along with the experts. We're sitting back and we're listening and we're enjoying them playing. And of course, when we're listening to music through our headphones, it's a passive thing. So it can go both ways. But when we're listening to the experts, it becomes a question of where does this divide come from? What makes certain people expert musicians and others not so much? What causes certain people to become more successful with music compared to others? And a number of things can play a role. Technical skills certainly are generally important, where if you're in the orchestra, if you're in a jazz band, if you are, I'm borrowing a friend's laptop and it seems to be very hypersensitive. So if it advances slides before I notice, just raise your hand. A jazz band, a rock band, those with good technical skills, playing their instruments and singing, are often more successful. And there's something called musicality, which is really kind of a squishy term. It's difficult to define, but Webster Dictionary defines it as sensitivity to, knowledge of, or talent for music, or the quality or state of being musical. So I think this can be a number of things. I was actually looking it up on a website, like what the heck is defined as musicality? And they mention things like singing in tune, jamming, having good rhythm, writing music, writing notation, improvising a solo. Apparently these are all things that are considered musicality. But certainly I would argue that those things can be part of creativity too, which is the next factor that seems to be important. And I think that helps you with composing a good piece of music if you're creative musically, or how expressive you are when you play an instrument. I think that could count as creativity. And one thing that maybe is not mentioned as often, to make a great musician, marketing is important. So if you are playing beautiful sonatas, but you're just in your own bedroom and no one else gets to hear it, no one's going to really consider you a great musician because no one's ever heard it. So things like getting your song on the radio or uploading it to YouTube and it getting a lot of people listening to it, or just, playing in local shows and things, that all counts as marketing, and that can help get people to know your music and therefore say, hey, that person is a great musician. I've listened to them, I've seen them play every time live, and they're amazing. And certainly with all of these, the relative importance of these factors may depend on the type of music that we're talking about. But I'd say that in almost every case, they all are important to some degree. And of course, music is, like, a great musician is a partially subjective thing as well. I mean, what I consider to be awesome music, you might hate, and vice versa. People often have very strong opinions about what is good music and what is not so good music. So there is a subjectivity to it as well. So an obvious question to ask is, are people born into being talented musicians? Is it, like, not necessarily for some of us, and so there's no point in trying, no point in taking lessons, because, you know, if you aren't born with the talent, you may as well quit while you're ahead? Or is it something that pretty much all of us could learn through lots of practice? And when you think of things being innate, are there early signs in childhood that would point towards this? Like, as soon as you step out of the womb, you're crawling to the piano and you're composing some amazing piece of music. Obviously, probably not that extreme, but, you know, there's been some anecdotes of people who started at quite young ages. And is that an indicator that you are meant to be a great musician? Like, if you hand two children a musical instrument and one of them is just totally fascinated by it and loves the sound that comes out of it and spends hours with it, and the other one just drops it and is like, no, I'd rather play with my stuffed animals, would that be an indicator that one of them will become a great musician and the other one will not? And it is unclear how reliable those traits are. But for example, Stravinsky was a famous Russian composer, and apparently he was imitating peasant songs as early as 2 years old. Arthur Rubinstein, he's an excellent pianist, and he mastered piano playing at a very young age. He also liked singing a lot, and this was all before he even spoke, really. So he was fascinated with music even before he started talking. And then, of course, we have to bring up Mozart because, you know, at age 3, he was already playing things on the piano. So that's all very, very impressive stuff. But it's important to keep in mind that these are all case studies. These are all anecdotes. And this isn't necessarily a reliable predictor of success. And it doesn't give us a full picture. Maybe a lot of kids do that. Maybe a lot of kids crawl over to the piano and start playing, but because they weren't successful later, we never hear about them. So it's a tough call. A gentleman named Sosniak wanted to look at this a bit more. So in 1985, he interviewed parents of over 20 professional musicians in the US, and as far as he could tell from how he looked at it, there was no clear pattern of unusual musical activity for the children at a young age. And a more comprehensive study was done maybe 10 years later, in which Howe and his colleagues did something similar but at a much larger scale. So they interviewed parents of about 260 children, and they looked at the subsets of these children. They were divided into different groups. So one group of children attended a highly selective music school in the UK. Another group, so think of this as tiers of success musically. So we're starting with the top. They were admitted into this highly sought after, very difficult school to get into. Another group was clearly good enough to get an audition at this school, but they were ultimately not admitted. So they're kind of the next rung. The third one, they inquired about the school, so maybe the parents were like, yeah, they show some potential. I think they might belong here, but ultimately they didn't apply, so maybe that's the next rung down. And then the fourth group was those that played an instrument at a local school, so that's a little bit more standard. And then the fifth group, they played an instrument, but they stopped within a year. So that would be kind of closer to the non-musician realm. So think of this as being ordered in terms of their musical ability going from highest to lowest. And for this study, they interviewed the parents and they were asking them various questions about their children's habits when they were younger. So, at what age did you first notice your child singing? At what age did you first see your child making rhythmic or dance movements in time with music? At what age did your child first show a liking for musical sounds? At what age did your child first display a high degree of attentiveness to music? And at what age did your child make a spontaneous request to be involved in or to experience music? And I would think right off the bat this could be super challenging to even remember exactly these dates, but maybe if they have like diaries that they wrote these things down, like, oh, child started singing for the first time, let me mark that down in the diary, then maybe you could actually get some good information here. And here are the results. As a whole, nothing was really popping out as far as age differences go across groups. So if you go down the rows, those are the different questions that were asked. And if you go across the columns, those are the different groups. So group 1 would be the most successful group, and going down to group 5. So you can see we have the age of starting. So 1.7 years old, 2.24, 2.78, 2.12, 2.12. And then you can keep looking at the different ages. And overall, you don't really see a huge difference across the groups. There's not like a dramatic increase where you start really young and you get older, and therefore that explains the results. But what they did find is, so none of these 4 bottom ones were not significant, but this one there was actually a significant difference. So group 1 was younger when they first started singing. So they thought maybe that's an indicator of success later on, is like when your child first starts singing. But even there, that's not a compelling difference, really. It's significant, but very small. So group 1, 1.7 years old. The others were a little over 2 years old. That's not a huge difference. And they were also curious about the environment that the children were in, with questions like, at what age was your child first regularly sung to sleep? How old was your child when you first sang to them on occasions apart from bedtime? At what age did you first listen to music together? How old were they when they when the first musical toy was present in the house? And how old were they when the first keyboard, string, woodwind, or brass instrument was present in the house? As to why percussion instruments are left out, I don't know. I support anyone who plays the drums. I think that's great. So essentially they're asking, did having contact with music at an early age serve as a predictor for musical success later on? And so this is looking at percentage of children with no instrument in the house in the first year. So if this was kind of a compelling argument, you would think the percentage of children with no instrument in the house in the first year would be lowest here and then go higher, 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 or something. But really, it's kind of a mixed bag here. So that also doesn't seem to be very convincing as far as an indicator of later success. And also, if you look up this particular paper, I think the figure captions are all messed up. So if you look at this and it has a totally different description, that would be why. Confused the heck out of me. Oh. Okay, so ultimately, only the age of first singing showed any hint of being relevant, and even that was not a super convincing difference across the group. So I would take that significance with a grain of salt. Replication is very important with research. And a lack of strong relationships suggests that it is difficult to predict these musical outcomes at an early age. Okay, so ultimately, musical behavior as a child and the environment of the child, at least based on the way they approach these in this study, has little to do with later success. So what can we glean from this is that it seems quite difficult to predict musical outcomes, based on these early childhood indicators. So if not early childhood, anyone want to wager a guess as to what might be a potentially obvious indicator? Don't be shy. I shouldn't have said obvious. That puts too much pressure on you. What about hours of practice? That seems plausible to me. So we in music, more so than I think a lot of things, we have this strong tendency to say, oh, this person is just really talented. We do that more with music than, say, being a good surgeon. We don't tend to be like, oh, that doctor is just really talented. We acknowledge that they probably put in a lot of hours to become good at what they're doing. Same with being a chess player. I think that requires a lot of hard work. Being an athlete, you work on it. You work really hard at it. And I think that gets underappreciated when it comes to musicians. So hours of practice seem like a good way to go. So this study was looking at a music conservatory, a very prestigious place, one that's very hard to get into, and it was divided into 2 tracks. So one track was the performance track, where people are doing really well. They're really good musicians, and they have a shot at becoming actual performers, like professionals in an orchestra, say, or soloists. And it's a super competitive area. It's extremely hard to get into a professional orchestra. And it can be kind of like the equivalent of getting into the NBA for your music career. Like, it is very hard to become a member of a professional orchestra. So that was one track. The other track is still people who are very dedicated musicians. They're good enough to get into this program in the first place, but perhaps they feel like they wouldn't make it as the professionals, but they still want to have careers in music. And so they take the music teaching track. So they become teachers of music. And certainly being a music teacher is nothing to sneer at. I think that's a great thing to do. But arguably, it's less competitive than the professional track. And Erickson asked these groups about their practice habits, like hours of practice per day. And it turned out that the students in the performance track were getting about 2 times as many hours of practice in compared to the teaching group. So that's a huge difference. So based on this, it seems that hours of practice would really be what it boils down to. So then Sloboda did another study a few years later, actually following the same group, those 5 groups that we discussed earlier. And he wanted to know if talented kids learn faster and require less hours of practice. Okay, so looking at these 5 groups again, so we've got group 1 is the top row, group 5 is the bottom row, and then along the columns we've got the different ages spanning from 4 to 16. So they're looking at the amount of formal practice per day in minutes for each of these groups at each of these ages. And what you can see, like with group 5, for example, and I think they just didn't have enough data to collect for age 16, but they start off with like 10 minutes a day, 8.7, 7.2, then they start to increase a little bit, 16, 14, 15, and end at around 30 minutes a day. So let's compare that to group 1. We start off with 17 minutes, not a huge difference. Then it jumps up to 22, 34, 46, 65, and we're already at 208 minutes over here. So, and let's compare this one since we have data here. 191 minutes versus 31 minutes. That's a huge difference as far as the amount of minutes per day that they're practicing. And this is another way of looking at the results. So this is cumulative amount of practice. So each of the curves is a different group, and group 1 is this top curve here. And so this is cumulative number of hours of practice over these age ranges. So they didn't have enough data here to extend it. It would be interesting to see if this kind of levels off or if it increases at all. But let's look at 13. Like already there's a huge divide between what group 1 is doing versus the rest of these groups. And you can already see it kind of shooting off here, and everyone else is kind of a little bit lower, really at an early age. Already at like 8 years old, there's a difference that's starting to emerge. But you can see that they kind of started off the same at an early age, and as they got older, that's when the difference started to come about. And group 1 achieved a higher grade level, which basically means they have these performance exams to see how well they're doing, and group 1 was doing better after 4 years than students in any of the other groups. So they're getting these better grades ultimately with their performance. So it doesn't seem like group 1 just got better with the same amount of practice. It seems like they really were putting in the time, and that time was ultimately what led to getting better grades. Okay, so hours of practice seem to be where it's at, but easier said than done. Putting in that many hours is hard work. So perhaps instead of looking at who is talented, we should be looking at why certain people have a strong drive to put in the time compared to others. Like, what is the motivating factor that inspires them to actually put in the extra time? And that part, I think it is being studied, but it's not super clear at this point. But it could be related to certain personality traits, for example. And certainly another consideration would be support, like parental support. So if your parents are supportive of you spending countless hours practicing, that seems to help. That seems to be a good indicator. And that's not to say necessarily parents who have their own success with music. Actually, parents who are successful musicians themselves, that does not tend to be an indicator of better support and better success of their children. And that might be because they're such good musicians, they are more critical of their children, and maybe that's harder on the children, and it's a whole stressful mess. Whereas parents who are not musicians themselves, they might be really impressed. Like, that baby's drumming, I'm super impressed by you. And that can help with the support overall. So maybe they're just less critical and more supportive. Okay, so switching topics a bit. Another question is, how good are we at judging different music performances? How reliable are these assessments? And we'll be exploring classical music here, where technical skills are more strongly critiqued than perhaps some other genres. And with classical music, they have competitions pretty often. Those are pretty common, so that's another reason to explore them. And these competitions can have a huge impact on the professional careers of these musicians. So, because of that, one would hope that the judges who judge these competitions are pretty reliable in their judgments. And keep in mind that in these competitions that are super competitive, all of the performances are probably top-notch. They're already probably excellent. So exactly what the judges are critiquing on could be a little bit more nuanced, a little bit harder to define. For example, the expressiveness of the performer might have an impact. So these things can be somewhat more subjective. So there was a study done in the 70s where some well-established, experienced judges were asked to rate a series of performances, and they were listening to recordings of performances, so they weren't seeing what the performances were, they were just listening to recordings. And what they didn't know is that some of the recordings were actually presented to them twice. So they wanted to see how good their reliability was. Like when they heard the performance the first time and they gave it a rating, and then they heard it a second time, unbeknownst to them, and they gave it a rating, were these ratings at all similar? And unfortunately, they found that their reliability was actually quite poor. In other words, their ratings of the performances were not consistent from one presentation to the next. So very poor test-retest reliability, if you will. What did seem to matter was performance order. So there were some order effects here. Performances that were played later were judged more positively than performances that were played earlier. I don't know exactly why that would be. I don't know if it's like you're getting closer to the point of having to make your decisions, your final decisions, and so you're like, oh, everything sounds great, I'm just gonna rate everything highly, or they just get tired. I don't know. We're all human. It can be difficult. Another thing that can affect judgments is expectations about certain performers. So if you know that you're listening to a well-known musician, for example, who's been rated highly in the past, you might think more positively about them compared to someone who's a no-namer that you know nothing about and you have no expectations. And certainly music isn't the only thing that has these issues with subjective judgments. Any sort of art form where there isn't a clear right versus wrong answer can struggle with that sort of thing. Thinking about like works of art, for example, that can be difficult. And you can be influenced by other people. So for example, if you're judging a piece of art and you're amongst someone who is considered a very well-established art critic, for example, and their opinion can actually influence your opinion. So we're very susceptible to things that might bias us in certain ways. Okay, so this study was published about 6 years ago now. Looked at how visualizing musical performances affects our judgments of them. Most of us would think that listening to a piece of music matters more than watching a piece of music in terms of how you rate how good a performance is. Obviously, because it's music and it's sound, and the sound is what matters, right? And so they took recordings of musical performances, both audio and visual, and these were from a classical music competition, and they had novices rate the performances and see how closely their ratings corresponded to those of the judges at the competition, so professional judges. And they had to judge which of 3 performances they thought was the winner. And they would get money if they chose correctly, so there was some financial incentive there. And when asked straight out, like, which do you think would be a better indicator as far as judgment goes? Do you think listening to the sound would give you a better estimate of who won, or do you think the video? And the novice listeners were like, well, obviously sound. Only a few people were like, looking at it obviously would be the way to go. But they were given the option to go with sound or go with video as far as what they wanted to use for their judgments. And there were some in both categories. And most people picked audio, but for those who picked video, it turned out they were actually much more accurate in predicting the winner than those who picked the audio. Yes?
Did the video show audience reactions and judges' reactions?
That's a good question. I doubt it, but I haven't actually seen the videos. That's a very good question, because that could also influence it. If the audience is getting really into it, that would also, that'd make it tricky. Though I guess if you're at like a classical competition, most people are probably pretty stoic when they're watching, unlike a rock concert where people are like, they got their lighters out and stuff. So no group was perfect as far as their judgments, but they were above chance when they watched the video versus when they were listening to just the sound. And then they had the same thing. They did the same thing for professional musicians and had them rate which performance they thought was best, either using audio using video or using audio plus video. Awesome. And it turned out video only won again. So even video plus sound was kind of around the place that sound only was. Video only was the winner again. That just blows my mind. So it goes to show, if you want to be a professional musician, the expressiveness that you put into your performance can matter a lot. Producing good sound, huge plus, but also expressiveness seems to matter quite a bit. One odd thing about this study is that they only presented subjects with like a 6-second excerpt, which is a pretty brief amount of time. So it would be interesting if someone redid this but did it for full pieces of music and see if that changes the results that they get. Another interesting question is how good are we at judging musical instrument quality? For example, one of the most highly sought after violins for musicians is the Stradivarius violin. They're super expensive, they're older, they're very well crafted, they're made of some particular magical wood. People claim that they have a very rich sound that's hard to get with modern violins. And people have tried to pin down exactly what it is about these violins that makes them so special and why, people spend, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars on these things. And they'll rent them from museums, or they'll get some sponsor who's a super wealthy person that happens to have one of these, and they'll have it on loan so the musician can borrow it. But as far as what makes them so special, they couldn't come up with anything. They were looking at the type of wood. They looked at all these different physical characteristics, and they could not pin down what it was that made them so special. So they also did something where they had famous, professional musicians do a blind test. So they gave musicians these Stradivarius violins, and they had them play them, as long as they wanted to, without looking at them. So that wouldn't be an indicator. They couldn't look down and be like, I know what that is. And then they were comparing that to another very nice violin, but a more modern one that is way less expensive. And what they found is that despite the musicians saying, I would definitely prefer the Stradivarius, because obviously, when they actually were playing them blinded, they often chose the new violin as the one that they thought was the Stradivarius, as they thought that was the better one. And in fact, they said that's the one they preferred of the two. And they actually did this study a couple of times. I think the first study, people made some complaints, you didn't control for this, you didn't control for that, you didn't control for that. So then they redid it and, made sure to control for everything that people thought would be an issue, and they still got the same results. So don't waste your money, I guess, is the take home there. Go to a museum, admire them, but you don't necessarily have to own one. Okay, moving on again. Music generalization. People spend a lot of time and money on music, expensive instruments, hours of practice. So an obvious question to ask is, what are the benefits of practicing playing these musical instruments, both long and short term? Certainly, the more you practice, the better a musician you'll probably become, so that's already a plus. But are there other more general benefits, maybe some cognitive benefits? And actually, when I was preparing this lecture, I got this in my news feed. So, everyone's listening all the time, and, we're not safe. But it was saying music lessons were the best thing your parents ever did for you, according to science. And then they went on to mention all of the things that are improved when you take music lessons. It improves your reading skills, and your verbal skills, and your mathematical skills, and your spatial temporal reasoning, and it helps your grades, and raises your IQ, helps you learn languages more quickly, makes you a better listener, slows the effects of aging, strengthens your motor cortex, improves your working memory, improves your long-term memory for visual stimuli, makes you better at managing anxiety, enhances your self-confidence and self-esteem, and makes you more creative. Wow, that's awesome. But when you see pop articles like this, first of all, check to see if they cite anything at all. If they're just making broad claims without citing any actual research, nix it entirely. But also go to the source, see what these articles are actually saying, because a lot of times what you find with research can be, very tiny effects, if anything, and then it goes into mainstream media and they're like, oh my God, it turns you into Einstein, it's awesome. So take it with a grain of salt. Don't trust everything that you read in mainstream media. Okay, so one really popular example of this, how many people have heard of the Mozart effect, even if you don't know exactly what it is? Excellent, excellent. So yeah, it's still something that's talked about a lot. So it's a popular example. It comes from a Nature paper, and Nature is an extremely good research journal. Like, if you publish in Nature as a scientist, you're doing pretty well. You're sitting pretty as far as research goes. So this study was asked whether listening to Mozart for as little as 10 minutes a day, or just 10 minutes period, can enhance your cognitive skills. And what they found is that spatial reasoning skills on an IQ test, similar to something like this. You see one of these guys, and you're like, which cube, when you fold it up, think origami, would not be plausible based on this. So you look at these and you make a decision and you're like, okay, that is not plausible. This type of test, weirdly enough, you seem to get better when you listen to Mozart for 10 minutes. And that became known as the Mozart effect. And it became a pretty big sensation. I think the governor of Georgia at the time was so inspired that he decided that all of the infants in the state of Georgia, as soon as they're born, we are giving the parents a classical music CD, because if we can make all our babies smarter by giving them music to listen to, that's way cheaper than sending them all to private school. Certainly a very efficient way to improve your IQ score if you're looking for a quick fix. So what is the evidence here? Let's take a look. I will say off the bat, if you want to make yourself feel better and say, like, I just want to read an article today, choose this one, because it is perhaps the shortest article I've ever read. It'll take you about 5 minutes to read it. It's like less than a page. It has very little detail. And Nature articles do tend to be quite short, but this took it to a whole new level. So it was 10 minutes of listening to Mozart's Sonata for 2 pianos. So let's make you all smarter real quick. It's pretty enjoyable, actually. Could you feel your brains expanding? Okay, so that's what they listened to. After listening to it, they were asked to complete the cognitive test, this IQ test, and this was compared to 2 other groups. So instead of listening to Mozart beforehand, you could listen to 10 minutes of a relaxation tape, and I honestly have no idea what that is, if that's like whale sounds or what. Relaxation tape. And the third group had the least interesting task of sitting in silence for 10 minutes. Poor them. Unless you're good at meditating, then maybe not so bad. And what they found was that the spatial reasoning scores, and sorry that the words are cut off on the bottom there, I can fix that. The spatial reasoning scores were better for the Mozart group compared to the other groups. And their IQ scores on this task were about 10 points higher than the other groups, and this difference was significant. So it begs the question, if 10 minutes does that to you, what does like 10 hours of listening to Mozart do to you? Do you become the next Einstein? Well, several studies did try to investigate this effect further. They explored it in various ways, and they were failing to find the same effect again. But apparently some groups, if they did things exactly as the Nature paper did, the exact amount of time, the exact song, the same duration, they also found this effect with the spatial reasoning task. So there was some replication here. They were able to reproduce it. So that's kind of interesting. But what they found is that the effect went away after 10 minutes. So you have like 10 minutes of genius and then you're gone. Very fleeting. So why would this be? Why would the effect be so short-lived? Also, is it just a Mozart thing? Could it work with other classical music? Could it work with other types of music? Is it just music that has this effect? Or is it like a general phenomenon? So there's a lot of questions. So maybe it's not just Mozart. Maybe it's not even just music. Maybe it's generally about arousal. Maybe it's something cognitively stimulating that can help you do better on tests. So this follow-up study tried to replicate the initial findings, but they explored other types of music as well. Actually, not other types. I mean, it was still classical music, but another composer at least. And they compared the effects of listening to music to the effects of listening to a short story, thinking both of these options would be more cognitively stimulating and more interesting than sitting in silence. So they also had them listen to Mozart again, but they also had them listen to Schubert's Fantasia for two pianos, so we can check that one out. Also a totally lovely song. Not bad, not a bad pick. So yeah, both classical, but a good first start to see if this generalizes to any other music. And then they compared this to listening to a short story, or silence, again. And here are the results. The chart shows the mean number of items correct, so higher is better. And in the case of Mozart versus silence, so the top row there, Mozart scores were higher. And in that sense, they were able to basically replicate what they found with the original Nature paper. But they also found that listening to Schubert resulted in the same kind of improvement. So Schubert also higher scores than silence. So at this point, we could say maybe it's more of a classical music effect or something instead of a Mozart effect. But if you look at the Mozart versus the story, while story does look like a lower number, it's actually not a significant difference. So story and classical seem to be on the same level. So it's not even just music, it's maybe general arousal. So something that you find interesting to listen to could have the same effect. And to demonstrate this arousal or interest component, they asked whether each participant preferred Mozart or preferred the short story. And those who preferred Mozart showed an improvement in the Mozart condition over the short story, and those who preferred the short story actually showed an improvement for the short story over Mozart as far as their score went. So it does seem like preference plays a role. So at this point, I would say, before you take a test, find something that you enjoy listening to and listen to that. Easy enough. So not unique to music. Perhaps a better approach for each individual is, listening to something that you like, and that maybe will improve your IQ score, maybe for only 10 minutes, but it's something. As to why the spatial reasoning aspect of the IQ is the thing that seems to keep improving and not other aspects, I think that's still a mystery. It's not super intuitive to me why that would be the thing that is improving. So those were the short-term effects that we've explored so far. Let's delve into longer-term effects of music. Well, if you trust the title of this paper, it would suggest indeed music lessons can enhance your IQ. And in this study, they had 132 children, and each were randomly assigned to one of 4 groups. That's already a huge plus. So instead of only following children that chose to do music or chose to not do music, they randomly assign them. So that can rule out certain things like socioeconomic status or different personality traits or things that could also co-vary in a way that hurts you as far as explaining where the differences, which differences are actually causing the effect. So randomizing your study is a great option. So they're looking at people that were either taking piano lessons, taking voice lessons, taking drama lessons, or nothing. So, and to be totally ethical, after the 36 weeks of the study was over, those who were put into the sad nothing category could have the option of taking lessons the following year. So just making sure that it's well balanced. Family support is no longer a thing, but it's good to actually keep track of these things just in case, even when you randomize, there could be some accidental bias that comes in. So looking at their socioeconomic status, looking at parental support and things like that is also still good to just keep tabs on that stuff. So the question is, do music lessons improve cognitive scores more than taking drama lessons or more than taking nothing lessons? And they did have a few people drop out, but on a whole, everyone stuck with it. So that's definitely something you have to accept if you're in research, is that everyone is participating in their own free will. So if people tend to drop out, there's nothing we can do. Attrition rate is a real thing. But on a whole, everyone stuck with it, so that was good. And maybe the parents moved away or something, things that can't be controlled for. The ages across the groups were similar. They were all between 6 and 7 years old, which is adorably young, and their family incomes were similar, their IQs were similar. I think there were small differences in each case, but nothing was deemed significant. And what they found was that after these lessons that they took, IQ scores were significantly different. So that's the bottom 2 rows here. So you look at the IQs before lessons and after lessons. In every single case, there is an improvement. So that's cool, but it might also mean they just got older and slightly smarter. But for the no lesson group, they had the least amount of improvement. So that's already kind of supporting this story of no lessons seems to be the least beneficial. Here's a look at the data in a different way. And this is also, I have to give you all my life lessons about research, but it's good to explore your data look at it in different ways, visualize it in different ways, to help you better understand what your data is. That's not the same as p-hacking. Don't just run every statistical test you can think of until you find something significant, but just looking at it, visualizing it, making sense of it, very important. So if we look at it in a different way, what you can see is they're plotting the mean increase in the overall IQ scores for each group. And what they want to argue is that the overall improvement in scores was greater for the keyboard and voice groups. Overall improvement is greater for these guys than for these guys. So in that sense, music is winning. An interesting sub-finding that's not shown here is that the drama group did have an improvement in one IQ area that the other groups did not, and that was an increase in social intelligence, which kind of makes sense. Being in drama involves effective communication, more interactions with others, so it kind of makes sense that you would get an improvement in that area. But overall, IQ scores better for keyboard and voice. But, and again, replication studies are important, so they find this effect here, but, it should be done with another group of children in another randomized way and see if we get the same effect again. And it's important to note, the research that tends to get published is research that shows some significant effect. A lot of times when people get null results, it's harder to publish those. So maybe this has been tried before, but nothing came of it. The results were null and it didn't get published. So that's definitely an issue with research these days. And they're working on it. They're trying to get people to pre-register their studies, and journals can say, okay, we've looked at your methods, we've looked at all the plans you are planning on as far as running statistics and things, and we're happy with it. So whether or not you get a significant result, we will publish it. But more often than not, journals like flashy things that show significant effects, and so those are the things that tend to get published. And I think this author, Schellenberg, I think he's moved away from doing studies like this, and instead he's becoming more interested in what personality traits might lead to musical success and whether these are the same traits that lead to success in other areas. I haven't been following it, but it'd be interesting to see if he's found anything yet. Okay, so this is an in-progress replication study because replication is awesome. This is actually being led by Andrew Oxenham and his postdoc, another postdoc in our lab, Kelly Whiteford, and it's this massive replication study that they're working on. And they're looking at studies that have shown significant effects in both near transfer and far transfer effects. So, do musicians have better melody discrimination? Do they have better motor coordination? Do they have better pitch discrimination? These would all be considered near transfer because they're things that are pretty obviously linked to music. Music involves melody, so being able to discriminate different melodies better makes sense. Playing an instrument involves motor coordination, so having an improvement in motor coordination makes sense. Pitch discrimination, same story. Far transfer would be more of speech perception, like looking at how good are musicians at pulling out speech information from a noisy environment. Think like cocktail party problem, where you have a ton of people around, you're trying to listen to one person talk, and it's really hard because of all the other people talking. That sort of thing, there's been some indication that musicians are better at pulling out speech from noise. And so these are the things that they're going to look at. And the reason that they feel that it's important to get replication with these types of studies is, one, a lot of them involve small sample sizes. So, if you have a handful of musicians and a handful of non-musicians, and you find an effect, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to generalize to the population as a whole. So you're thinking of you're looking at extreme ends of the spectrum, whereas most of us fall somewhere in the middle. So That's one part of the problem. And that's the non-representative samples problem. There's also the law of large numbers, and that goes to the small sample issue, is that the smaller the sample that you're looking at, the less likely it is to be a true representation of the population as a whole. So the more people you collect data from, assuming that they're a fair representation of the population, the more likely that your findings might be an indication of what is going on in the general population. So these are things that they want to explore. And it's a study that is 6 universities that are involved in this study. So they're making it a very big study. They're replicating 8 different experiments, and they are each going to collect, each of these universities is collecting data from like 60 subjects. And I think it's 60 subjects of like younger age range, and then maybe another handful of subjects that are like older age range, and they're going to be part of it, a small part of the study. But yeah, so Kelly has had to go to each different university that's involved and help them set up all their equipment and make sure that everything is calibrated and make sure that everyone's kind of in the same boat so that all of their, findings are not because of some weird fluke because, the equipment wasn't calibrated at one site. So she's traveling a lot to make sure that all of these sites have the same setup and are running the experiments in the same way. And so this is a work in progress, and you can actually, these are the studies that they are replicating. So the different advantages they're looking at is enhanced analytic listening for non-speech sounds, more robust fundamental frequency coding for linguistic pitch in quiet, enhanced speech perception in noise, stronger encoding of upper harmonics for phoneme in noise. So phoneme is like da, ba, ah. Decreased age-related decline for speech perception in noise, enhanced frequency selectivity, enhanced speech perception in background speech, informational masking, and enhanced pitch discrimination. So they have their work cut out for them as far as what they're looking at. And the ones that are in red are the EEG studies. So she also had to go and check out all their EEG equipment, and they would hook her up and run some preliminary tests. It's a lot of work. So this is Kelly. She's delightful. Highly recommend her. And she is writing a blog about this. So if you're interested, you can check out the soundbrainscience.com/blog, and she gives updates occasionally on what's been going on with the study and what their progress is. They also did pre-register this study, so you can check out this link if you want to see the details of the study and just see what pre-registering a project even looks like. So very cool, very cool. We'll see what happens. All right, in summary, it seems like music expertise comes more from practice, so no shortcuts. It's not about talent. And the Mozart effect doesn't seem to be specific to Mozart or even to music, and it may be best understood in terms of general arousal. And longer-term general benefits of musical training may exist, but the effects so far have been small, so take those with a grain of salt as well. I remember Andrew telling a story about a piano manufacturer study where this piano manufacturing company placed pianos in the homes of some children and provided lessons. And after 1 year, there were improvements in school performance. And they're like, awesome, this is going to sell so many pianos if we can show that it actually makes students do better in school. So they're like, let's try this for another year. So after 2 years, they found an even more improvement in school performance. So that this is amazing. We are heroes. This is so great. We're going to sell so many pianos. Let's try for another year and see what happens. By the 3rd year, the effect totally went away. So it could be that the effect exists during certain developmental stages or something, but then kind of evens out or vanishes after a while. So had they stuck with just the 2 years, they might have been okay. But this is more realistic. Maybe these effects just do go away after a while. Any questions about any of that? Comments? Thoughts? Concerns? Everyone wants to play musical instruments now? Because you love music, not because it makes you smarter. That's the key. Okay, that's all I have to say. Make sure to take your quiz from today's lecture. On Tuesday, you get a guest lecture from Todd Schwartzberg, who will talk about music therapy. He's a super cool guy. I've seen some of his music therapy sessions. He does amazing work. I love it. And then on Thursday, it's a holiday, so no class. So next week is a good week. Come and enjoy. And then don't come on Thursday.